Why don't we start with an introduction to today's topic and myself, I'm your speaker. Hello. And then we'll dive into the talk. Um, so my name is Steph, or Steph Herman. I'm with the IWRC. I've been a wildlife rehabilitator for, depending when you start counting, many, many years. And I've worked with a couple different types of organizations, both sort of multi-species centers, home rehabilitation, oil spill, just a lot of different little things. And one of the things that I'm just really passionate about is um, uh, getting data, getting more information for us to make better and more decisions about. So today we're going to talk about show your work, using the data that you're already collecting to um, sort of improve the status of, or the state of wildlife rehabilitation for us all. And I do want to encourage you to ask us questions, involve and make suggestions for all the other participants to see and benefit from during the talk itself. If you don't mind putting those things in the chat, if you do have questions and things, Kai will help me sort of track those and make sure that you get an answer, even if it might be at the end of the talk, just so that, because I don't know, if I get my brain off onto a different track, who knows where we're going to end up, to be honest. So do put those questions in the chat. We'll make sure we get to them. And we'll also hopefully have some time to just chat at the end for anybody who is interested and has some suggestions. Today, just by recognizing that you are all collecting data. Every single day that you work, you're collecting some sort of information. And we want to just make use of that data as best we can, but we got to recognize that we just don't have time. That there's a lot of constraints on us in terms of both time and sometimes even expertise that kind of limit us in terms of what we share and when. But I think the thing that I really want to start with is just recognizing that there is this great need in our field for better information. I want better information personally when I'm practicing because I feel like I need that in order to take better care of my patients. There are things that I don't understand right now that I feel like could ultimately result in more animals going back into the wild. It can be hard to make judgment calls and decisions when I don't have a full understanding of the situation. And like sometimes I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants a little bit. And that can be really challenging, right? Because I want to make really good decisions and have really good rationale for it. And sometimes there's just not information to back that up. There isn't a way for me to make a better decision than what I'm making right now. And then also, sometimes I need to be able to evaluate and judge if what someone else is telling me that I need to do or try or a change that might be necessary, or that they're telling me is necessary, whether that's actually a good change. Like, how do I know if the differences between what my protocol is right now and the protocol that someone else is using, is that important? Does that, does that change mean that there will be a difference in animal care, or is that change not so important and it's okay to do it slightly differently and it's not going to have a big impact? It's really hard to know those things when we're lacking in evidence. And I mean, I have always wanted to be a part of getting that information and improving that situation. But I frankly get approached for collaborations on things that maybe aren't my priority, that they wouldn't necessarily help wildlife rehab as much, or they're things that kind of commonly get looked into, but they're not necessarily really advancing the field a lot. I might have lots of ideas or desire to launch my own projects, but I have limited time and frankly limited expertise. There's a lot of things that I'm not necessarily the right person to be pursuing that data, right? Or that project. Um, and then at the same time, it's just crazy busy all the time. I can think of so many cases and situations where now I wish I had taken a photo or collected the information a slightly different way. But at the time, I was just trying to get everything done and keep everyone alive. So my goal today is not to fix these problems for us, obviously, but just to start this conversation, Hopefully it can get bigger and more complex in the future. But I want to open it up. How do we as rehabilitators get the information that we really need most? And how do we keep moving along that pathway into the future? At the same time, uh, we have a lot of information that we're sitting on that currently maybe we're not making a lot of use of. And I don't want to disregard that or imply that the information that we already have and we're already collecting isn't helpful. It just hasn't necessarily been shared in a way that allows us to take advantage of it a lot of times. So I'm hoping that utilizing that just requires a slight change of our perspective, and that will give us access to this gold mine of information that we all pretty much have somewhere in our closets, basements, attics, hard drives, things like that. Okay, just see if we can get this to update for you. There we go. Okay. All right. So I think one of the things that we probably have all run into is the reality of how little information we actually have. The vast majority of what we think we know comes from domestic animals, sometimes from zoological, like permanent captivity situations, sometimes from natural history. But the reality is, wildlife rehab is a very unique sort of crossroads of all of those different things and several other different topics that makes it kind of unique. And a lot of this information doesn't directly apply. Once you scratch the surface on basically any topic, you're going to hear, oh, it depends. And oh, we think it's like that, but some species it might be different. Or thousands of little caveats about how, this is the best we have right now. And in the future, hopefully it'll get better, right? And that's just because we're missing a lot of basic information. I do want to recognize that many of us have years and years of experience, and that experience is incredibly valuable. I'm not trying to disregard that experience in any way, because I think with lots of trial and error, data from years of work that lives in our brains, we can really benefit a lot from that, right? But there's a difference between experience and evidence. And I think it has to do with how we use it. When you understand a little bit about how the human brain works, we find out that we search for patterns, we search for explanations. The way we tend to interpret data sometimes skews it in ways that we aren't even aware of. One example of this process might be confirmation bias, where we give more unconsciously, unintentionally, we give more weight to things that we recognize and see and observe that back up and reinforce our existing beliefs. And one of the tricky parts of it is the more certain we are, the more we think we know, the more we think we aren't susceptible to these things, the more likely that our conclusion isn't necessarily really reliable, because we haven't interrogated that and really watched out for it. So while experience is super valuable, it's not enough on our own when what we're looking for is improvement and progress beyond where we are right now. Experience helps us recognize patterns that we've seen in the past, right? So if you're walking a road and you've taken the wrong turn like 3 or 4 times, you could just avoid taking those turns at all and just get to where you're going. But that doesn't mean that your experience helps you to discover new pathways on its own. So what do we do, right? In my opinion, we need to start sharing our data. And the good news is, I think there are some ways we can do that pretty easily. Most rehabbers have a bunch of data. Do you record animal weights when animals come in or as they grow? Do you take temperatures? Do you record why animals arrive or what happens to them, or reasons that you might have needed to euthanize them? Do you keep progress notes, medical notes, necropsy results, diagnostics, fecals, lab results from in-house or from sending it out? Do you have any written care protocols or recipes or things like that? One of the things that I think we can think of when we start thinking about publishing and sharing information is we can have our focus narrowed down and think that what we really need to do is a bunch of experiments. And well-designed research projects are amazing, crucial, necessary. We're going to need to do those, but they're not the only way that we can move the needle. And I'm not trying to undermine how important actual research is, but wildlife rehab as a field is still at this place where so many of the species and situations that we're working with, even really common ones, don't actually have a lot of the basic facts published about them yet. Some of the things that we take for granted because we've experienced them and think they're just common sense. If someone were trying to enter the field and they were just looking through the published literature about how to do this work, they would have no idea where to even start. And what that means is that we don't have a foundation for our science to build on because science is iterative. It's about taking what was done before and building on it. It's about advancing and like tweaking things and seeing what happens, right? And we can't do that when we don't really have a starting place. That kind of holds us back. So, what that means is that there's room for a lot of different ways that we can share information that aren't necessarily this gold standard experimental design type research. Um, oh, no, it's getting away from me. I don't know if that showed up on the screen. Hopefully it doesn't flip through everything. Uh, yeah, so I think that there are some possibilities, and I'm going to share some details about a couple different ways that you might consider publishing some of your data that has a slightly lower barrier to entry than designing and running a full research project. And this includes things like case studies, sharing baseline data, sharing your care protocols, diets, enclosure design, anything that you have that you feel like you can share. There's probably a format to do so. It may not all go to the same place. And the last thing I want to recognize is that we are all really busy, but we also tend to cycle through busyness. Most rehabbers tend to either seasonally or at least you'll have these peaks of being really busy and then it'll slow down a bit, right? You can set things up so that you do not have a huge load during the busiest time of the year. We need to be conscious of that and just recognize that that's the reality is that right now, many of you are probably really busy and it is totally okay for you to hear this and decide it is not something that I can do right this second. But the next time you have a chance to breathe, think about what you can do to make it easier to gather data and eventually share it um, the next time it gets busy, right? Because that's also when we're generating data. Okay. Let me switch it. Oh, did it switch over? It switched over too many times. I got it. Okay. So the first one that I want to share is this. I want to talk a little bit about case studies. So in human and veterinary medicine practice, case studies are usually written up about rare, unusual, new, different sorts of things that practitioners are experiencing that aren't being experienced in enough volume to really collect data on and publish like a full-blown study on it because they're pretty rare. At the same time, you don't want those rare experiences to just disappear into the ether. And every time a practitioner runs into something unusual, that they would just assume that this has never happened before, right? So case studies fill this need, especially in those fields of providing some starting information that can at least give other practitioners a place to start if they experience something similar. And they can work the same way with wildlife rehab, right? So if you encounter a really unusual or rare species, if you encounter a problem that's unusual and you haven't necessarily seen it before or heard about it before, you try different treatment techniques or approaches and you kind of do a pilot test of something, you can totally use case study to share that. At the same time, again, wildlife rehab is not well documented, which means that sometimes we can use case studies to talk about things that are slightly more common and still have that be valuable. When we talk about case studies, there's a particular template or approach to it that different journals will ask for. I'm sharing right here. This is the template for case studies that are submitted to the Journal of Wildlife Rehabilitation, which is the journal that IWRC publishes. There's a lot of different places you can consider submitting. I'm using JWR as an example, one, because it's what we're familiar with, right? Because it's the IWRC journal, but also because it's one of a very few that does primarily focus rehabilitation content. And also, we want you to submit to us. Please submit to us. We want to publish your data and we want to share your work and we want to help you to, we want to help everyone take the next step, you know, and get the field to move forward. So just keep in mind that some of the requirements might be different if you're submitting somewhere else, right? Or their language might be a little different. So for the JWR, when you submit a case study, you want to identify it as such. There's a couple things that I want to mention. One, you do need to include your sample size. I think that sometimes when we talk about case studies, we can think that means an individual animal, like what happened with one particular case. And sometimes it can be one particular odd case. But I'm going to go over a couple examples in a minute where you can see that this is actually an opportunity to talk about similar cases as well and things you're seeing between more than one case. You do need to include references. Sometimes in-text citations are needed. I know that this is a hard thing for a lot of rehabbers, especially because not all journals are available for free. Google Scholars really helped and made a lot of things more available than they used to be, right? Because you can actually search up and see primary journal articles. But if that's not something you're trained on, it's not something you've done a lot of reading or using of these articles, they can feel tough to access for folks who haven't necessarily had that experience. I'm hoping that in the future we can offer some additional help with that for people who'd like it. But for today, I just want to mention that one, references are primarily you telling us where you got your information. So sometimes they can be primary journal articles. They can also be if you like read books or if you looked it up on Birds of the World, you know, that the website by Cornell, or things of that nature that are pretty reliable. You can also use those. But the really important thing about both references and citations is essentially you're not making everything up, right? You want to be really clear about the things that are your opinion or your experience versus the things that are kind of established facts that have other evidence to back them up, or things that other people are saying, right? Because what that does is it leaves a breadcrumb trail back through the literature. So someone who wants to come to the same conclusions that you did, or really evaluate and follow your logic, have this additional context that they can go back and look into. There are a number of different pieces to the to submitting a case study, you know, different parts of the paper that you want to have. I think most folks have probably run into the concept of an abstract, which is just a summary, but it can sound all fancy. You do want to make sure that you're clear about why this is an important case study, like what is interesting about what you're talking about. And you want to provide your context, your natural history, any background information that's important to understand the situation. You want to talk about what you saw and what you did, so both the results and the methods. And then you want to talk about management implications, which has a lot more to do with interpretation. Okay, I want to show a couple examples of case studies that have been in the Journal of Wildlife Rehab recently. This one in the middle, cross-fostering an endangered San Joaquin kit fox pup, is a great example of something kind of unusual. It's endangered. They don't come in all that much. It's a single case. This is kind of traditional when we think of case studies, I think. But on the left side, we've got providing music as auditory environmental enrichment to improve the welfare of hooded crows, which is a paper where they essentially went and they reported out some different behaviors that they saw in hooded crows that were exposed to music as enrichment, which is a really interesting way to kind of look at what behaviors are being elicited. Is this enrichment working well for them? Is this something we might recommend to other people? And then on the right side, we got cattle-associated traumatic injuries in koalas from 2010 to 2016. And that's just looking at a bunch of different cases over a time span that have some similarities and trying to see if there's anything in there that we can kind of pull out and look at more closely. So there's kind of a lot of different options. This is a fairly flexible template. Okay. The next type that I want to talk about briefly is baseline data. And this is just basic information that we don't necessarily have. We don't necessarily have what normal body temperature is for every species out there. We don't always know what the growth curves look like for young animals that are growing up, whether it's in the wild or in care, frankly, but definitely not in care. We don't necessarily have that published. What are the developmental milestones for the species that help you to understand what ages they are? What are their blood work parameters? What parasites do we frequently see when they come in, or what parasites do we almost never see when they come in? It's really interesting to hear about because, especially if you don't normally find things on a fecal flotation, maybe we see, in that species, fecal flotation doesn't actually work for the types of parasites that it tends to carry. Or maybe they tend to not have a very high parasite load. Like there's potentially a lot of different things that could clue us into, but knowing and starting with the fact that they might not have a lot of parasites showing up in when you're using this particular technique, really important thing to start with. That clues us in. Recovery timelines. This is hard, right? We always think about how our animals are so variable. How are we going to make any sorts of conclusions about how long it takes for any one of them to get better? But chances are, if we dig in, there's probably some things that we can estimate if we have some similarities. Like if we can start teasing apart what parameters affect the healing time, we might be able to start having some of our work be a little bit more predictable. Activity budgets is a fun one. I love this one for students. In the centers I used to work at, you couldn't necessarily work directly with the animals if you were under 18. This is a really good sort of project to have people like set up a camera or something, have them observe and mark down how much time animals use with different behaviors, and then compare that. Like maybe those animals are being really unusually active when certain things are happening, and that implies that you need to change the environment, or maybe they're not demonstrating behaviors that you really want them practicing before they get released. And you don't necessarily know that, right? So activity budgets can be really interesting. One thing that I want to go over relating to this data is what matters most is that you separate this data out into sort of functional categories, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then also that you're thinking about how the data is collected and doing that in a way that minimizes how like differences in the data that are coming from you. So to dive just a little bit more into functional groups, imagine we're talking about body temperatures and you run a facility, multi-species, and you get 500 animals a year. You take intake temperatures on every single animal that comes in. If you just give me an average and like this was the highest and this was the lowest of every single animal that came in, what am I going to do with that information? Too many species, too many variables. Some species are definitely going to have higher body temps than others. Like you're comparing apples to oranges. That's going to be tough to use. So while we want like a really big sample size sometimes, the more sample size we have, the more reliable we can determine our data is, the more we can assume that it is representative of the larger world beyond the animals that we sampled. You got to kind of temper that with what's going to be useful. So maybe you want to separate it out. Maybe you want to say only this species, only adults of this species, only babies of this species. But you can also kind of create functional groups that might be able to show you something interesting. So let's say with body temperatures, we know that it is possible for an animal to be hyperthermic and too hot, as well as hypothermic and too cold. If you get animals in and you're taking their temperature on intake and you're also noticing signs of hyper or hypothermia, you could potentially separate things out and say, okay, what's the average temperature of this species when I'm seeing signs that they are too hot? What's the range of temperatures that show up when they're showing visible clinical signs that they're too hot? How about when they're too cold? How about when I don't see anything? And then also we have the potential to look at things like, is there overlap there? Can an animal have a body temperature that is on the high end or potentially even too high, and we're not able to see the evidence of it externally? We don't necessarily know that or where that line is, right? So you can start to tease things apart as you start to get a little bit more specific with the data that you're looking at. At the same time, you need to be really careful about that sort of consistency of data. It's taking that same example. If you are taking the temperature when animals first come in, versus maybe you have another teammate who's taking the temperature for this study, but they're doing it after they've done the entire exam, everything else. And maybe all that handling and stress or potentially even struggling is increasing their body temperature. Then that temperature reading that you're getting is not necessarily reflective of the situation the animals, like it's influenced by you and how you did it and when you did it and the differences between the two of you versus let's say you decided, hey, we're going to take a temperature after 15 minutes. Well, that could be good because it means you're going to let them rest for 15 minutes. It could sort of equalize things. It's not so much about handling, but then maybe 15 minutes in your environment is going to remove some of those symptoms that you would have seen if the animal was hyperthermic when it first came in, right? So we do need to think about some of these ways that we influence our data, because it's fine for the data to be different because there's differences. Like it's fine for us to be like, okay, well, we've been taking temperatures of these animals and we're finding that there's a statistical difference between body temperature on average in the winter than in the summer. That's fine. But what's less fine is we think that, but the reality is in the summer, you had an intern contributing data who didn't actually know where the cloaca was and was sticking the thermometer into the feathers and not into the cloaca, right? So that's basically what I'm saying there. I hope that makes sense. I want to go over one example. Uh, this is an example that I'm hoping will help sort of illustrate and go into some of these conversations and just help you think about how you might use your data um, and sort of the considerations that might need to go into it. And I'm going to ask you guys for some, I'm going to ask you guys some questions. So you might need to type or unmute and answer. But oops, here we go. So this is a chart that I made a long, long time ago in one of my past lives at another facility I worked at, where we were looking at the differences between growth rate in eastern gray squirrels between two different care protocols. We were using a care protocol. We noticed an issue where we felt like animals were kind of like our weaning protocol was too aggressive. So we'd end up, instead of having a nice smooth, like the animals are kind of increasing in their weight until they get to a plateau and like they're eating on their own kind of thing. We were seeing a lot of, oh, we have weight loss and then we'll start them back on the formula and then we'll try to wean them off it again. And it just kind of went on for a little while. So we were trying to smooth that out so that we weren't trying to push them too fast. And we ended up with these two growth curves. The fall is the one after we tried to fix it, the spring is before. So I have two questions for you. One, what is getting in the way of us determining that this is fully, well, give me an idea of something that might be getting in the way of us determining that this is really just the rehab protocols that is resulting in this difference. Any ideas? Yeah, I think that's a really big one, is that we took these in two different seasons. We would need to know basically if there is any difference on any given protocol with how the animals respond to that protocol in the spring versus the summer. Different scales? Yeah, we could have some issues in terms of our scales being like they might have changed out. Maybe one broke in the middle of the summer, we replaced it or something like that. We might need to know that. Any other ideas? When the animal is weighed? Yeah, were we being consistent with when the animals were weighed? Yeah. Was the data collection protocol the same? Anything else? Okay, so these are all really good points. And some of them we had the answer to. Like we knew that we needed to weigh them. We weighed them all pre in the morning after stimulation and before they were fed. There's going to be a little bit of deviation there because, who knows if everybody stimulates them fully. Occasionally there's a little bit of unusualness there, but it was fairly consistent. But at the same time, we didn't have a lot of data from other seasons. That's a really big one. Um, Sex ratio. Yeah, I'm going to let you in on one of them. One of them is that we are doing this age. We're basing this by age. One of the challenges that I had going into this is that we weighed them every day. We didn't necessarily note like when their eyes opened or other developmental milestones. And animals don't come in at the same age or stay in care for the same amount of time. We didn't get all 40 of them when they were neonates and hairless. We got them at different times throughout, you know. And one of the challenges we have with rehab animals is that you end up with, you can have a 100-gram squirrel that's very old and very thin, and you can have a 100-gram squirrel that's a plump, lovely baby who's super young. There's this issue with age is not necessarily reflected in weight. And if you don't have developmental milestones, it's really hard. You can't really use that. You can't use just how much, you also can't just assume that when they wean, they're the same age because especially for this, what we're seeing here is there's a possibility that one protocol helped them to wean a little bit faster. Where the lines end is where they were fully independent. They stopped needing any sort of dietary support. Um, mhm. Yep, different sample size, litter size. Yeah, what their body condition was, what their nutritional condition was, variation between genders. Yeah, so there's a lot of potential for issues with this. At the same time, this could be really valuable information, especially if we continue to track this into the future, right? And what we did for this year was I went through personally and marked the development, like every day I looked at them. And if they had a developmental milestone they met that day, I would mark that for that day so that I could age them, not exactly the exact day necessarily, but as close as we could get. If we kept that up, if we kept up good, consistent weighing protocols, if we kept collecting this data, we could really dive in and we could see something about it. And it wouldn't have required very much for us to continue doing it. We did it 1 year with minimal impact to our program. So this is just an example of, if you think about it, there are ways to set it up and then later look at the data that actually helps you to get something valuable out of the information you're already getting. This only required one change to the way we were evaluating our patients. Maybe there's more than one that would be required for a different project, but for this one, we only needed a change that we were marking developmental stage. Okay, the last sort of group type of paper that I wanted to mention is what's called editorial content. This isn't necessarily peer reviewed, but this is something that's valuable. It's valuable to hear from each other. It's valuable to hear about different ideas that people have or are trying new things and what your experiences were with them. There are lots of different types of things you can share. This is just a tiny little list of a few of them, but I wanted to bring this up in part because one of the things we want to be careful of when we're sharing editorial content is that we're sharing these ideas and we're writing it in such a way that it is valuable to other people to try it, but we're also recognizing the limits of what we're doing. So let's say I have an enclosure that I think is going to help reduce damage to feathers. And that's why we're switching our enclosures, because we're pretty sure we've been seeing certain feather issues before, and this seems to resolve it, or we're hoping that it will resolve it. We didn't collect any data on that. So if I come to you and I say, here's a great enclosure layout, you should definitely do it because it's important not to damage their feathers. That's why you need to use this. We don't necessarily know if it's better or not. We haven't really collected any data on it. We can definitely say this is the impetus to changing it is we were seeing feather damage. We're hoping this will help. But unless we're actually going to collect data on this, it's probably not something that we should be telling other people that it does, as a fact. So that's just one thing to kind of be aware of. But there's lots of different things we should be sharing and talking about among each other. And it could be something small. Even if it's not something that goes into the Journal of Wildlife Rehab, there's a bunch of sort of shared places that we can share this type of information. Um, I mean, it could go in the newsletter, it could go in the Wildlife Rehab Knowledge Exchange forum. There's a lot of different places we can put it, but there's also room for it, especially especially really cool, interesting things in our journals. One thing I want to mention that I forgot to mention about baseline data and comes up here again, there isn't a template for this. This is there's a wide variety of different things that you might be doing and submitting that would fall under this category. And there isn't just a clear checklist of how to format that. So for this one, there's just a lot of topics out there. Just write it up, submit it. If we can use it, we'll use it, and we'll also provide some feedback if there's anything in there that we need you to adjust. For the baseline data specifically, though, our editor has agreed and is willing to consult to help you so that before you dive into a bunch of data and a bunch of work, and you write it all up and everything. She's got a lot of experience. It's Kieran. She's on this call, and we'll talk with her a little bit later. She's more than happy to help consult if with how you might go about using formatting and submitting this data in a way that's going to be usable. She's got a lot of experience with that. She's got a sharp mind for it. So if you need help with that, please let her know, and that can sort of reduce your workload long term. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the submission process because I would rather talk with all of you and have some Q&A and discussion. But I do want to mention a couple things. One, don't try to worry about this when you're busy. Don't worry about this when it's crazy. Just worry about getting the data and come back to it later. When you do come back to it, you're going to need something to help remind you what happened, in all likelihood. Because I don't know about you, maybe this is relatable, maybe not. I think the most important in the busy season is to be taking notes and pictures, and the notes need to be like something that you can look at that will trigger your memory. Because for me, I get through something, I'm like, okay, we did this interesting case or whatever. And a month later, I'm like, oh, yeah, we did do that, didn't we? There's been so much that's happened since then. Maybe a volunteer brings something up, and I'm like, that was this year? Oh my gosh. So take notes as you go about things that you might be interested in revisiting later. And I'd say that's basically between photos and taking notes like that. That's basically all you need to worry about in the busy season. Yeah, notes that'll make sense to future you. The other thing is that taking photos can be difficult, but if you have even just an old digital camera or something you don't mind leaving in the intake room or leaving in your treatment room or just dedicating to taking photos from your program, that can be really helpful as well. It can trigger you to take photos when you see it there, right? I know all of us carry phones around, and that's great. Sometimes stuff can get lost if it's just on your own personal phone. And it's also, kind of tough sometimes to track what case it was. So one of the protocols that I've used in the past is you just take a picture of the case number on the computer or on the paper, whatever you're using, and then take the picture, or vice versa, so that it's there on your camera roll right next to each other so you know what the picture belongs to. So do submit. Presentations are wonderful. I feel like wildlife rehab has become an oral sort of tradition. We are mostly talking and sharing our information over presentation these days. And although a lot of symposiums and conferences do publish proceedings, I find that it is rarer and rarer that wildlife rehab content actually gets published even in proceedings. So I would encourage you, if you have ever given a presentation to wildlife rehabbers or on wildlife rehab topics, to just consider how much easier it is when you take that talk that you put all of that work into to make it do multiple things for you. Turn it into a paper as well as a presentation. Save yourself some work, and also get that published for posterity so that you don't necessarily have to try to dig up that video or figure out where it was given or Like maybe it doesn't get hosted forever and stay online forever so that you can actually get back to it. Yeah, Kai.
Sorry, I was just clapping in celebration of
Oh,
that point.
yeah. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with sharing things orally, but it is so much easier to get more detailed and so much easier to find it later and do quick reference if it's published. It's just going to help our future us. Okay, so the very last thing I want to go over before we open this up is do plan for your next year. Take some time the next time it's slow to think about what you can do to make it easier to gather data and to gather helpful, consistent data the next time it gets busy. If you put a little bit of work into it before it gets busy, you don't have to put in a ton of extra work to make this happen. Now, if you plan it out, the reality is planned out data collection is just automatically going to be higher quality data. That's just the reality. That doesn't mean don't go back and look at your old stuff because I want you to do that and I want to hear about that. And also, we can improve things when we think it through ahead of time because we can control some of those variables that we become aware of. If you are a home rehabilitator or a single rehabilitator sort of program, then your life is going to be easier in terms of consistently writing and implementing a protocol. It is easier to do things all the same way when you're the same person. It is so much harder when there's 50 people and you're trying to get all of them to do the same thing. But there are a few different things that you can manage that can help with that significantly that also aren't huge lifts. Have a training about it. It doesn't have to be long, but you do want to go over it with people, whoever's going to be collecting your data. Think about what tools you can use that will help people be more consistent and help them to collect the data that you want. Maybe it's you do have to print a sheet out so that they can, write in or check little boxes or whatever every time they see something. But also think about what makes it easier for you on the back end to analyze it. Is there a format that it would be helpful to put things in? Is that easier to do sort of as you go every time you see a case? Consider recruiting volunteers for data entry, analysis, statistics, even writing. I just want to remind people, I say this all the time till I'm blue in the face, and I'll keep doing it. Volunteers are professionals in their own lives. They are professional people, even if they're cleaning poop for you. They have skills that sometimes we don't have, and we should take advantage of it. And there is nothing wrong with you being focused on animal care and them helping you with the data part of it if that's a skill that they have. Obviously, you want to make sure they have that skill, but use them. Get to know your volunteers, understand their skills, put them to work where they can actually do you a lot of benefit and good, even if if they want to feed squirrels, fine. But if they're really good with data, try to leverage that. And then reach out to research collaborators. I'm going to go over this in a lot more information um, at the Wildlife Disease Association later this month. I'm talking about how rehabbers can work with researchers and researchers can work with rehabbers and tips for that. But I wanted to throw this in here today because I do think it's really important. Frankly, we're specialists in wildlife rehab. That doesn't mean that we're always specialists in collecting, analyzing data, or designing experiments, or any of this other stuff. Even writing up our papers are not necessarily what we're focused on, and that's okay. There are people out there who this is their entire life and their job. We should be partnering with them. And I can tell you right now, a lot of them incredibly excited to have the access to the data and the patients and the samples that we have access to and that we're not using. So we should be able to collaborate with them. But one thing that I run into or ran into constantly is what I brought up at the beginning of the talk, where sometimes we get approached by collaborators who have no idea what we actually need to know, what information we collect, and how to work with us. And so I do have a couple tips to leave you with. One, be public about what kind of data you already collect. What is easiest for you is what you already have to do for care, right? So tell them what that is. If you're a larger facility, considering having a page on your website that is for potential researchers and suggest to them what data is easily available, maybe what data you feel like is within reach for you to access if they don't, if they need you to help with that. But be really clear about it And two, list example questions and topics that you want to see looked into. Because I think it's really hard to have imagination about what we need to know when you're not in the field. So we know what we need to know. Tell them, let them know. And also, that can be really inspirational. If someone comes across that, they're considering doing a project. Maybe they're, a college or high school student who is trying to do a project and they see a topic that they can help with and interest them. Then you've just got something functional when before they were going to reach out to you to ask if they could look at your admissions data for the 1,000th time. Um, Sorry, personal experience there. But do make that public. And if you don't put it on your website or you don't have a website, consider writing up a document with this so that if someone comes to you and says, I want to do a project, you can hand it to them and say, this is what we're looking for. And it doesn't mean that you don't accept potential topics outside of there. It just means that, you're giving them some ideas. Be proactive and reach out. If you have a project you want to do, consider, or even topics you want to see, you could potentially get what I just talked about into a PDF and send it to the university department head who runs, this particular thing, or some grad students. Um, you know, uh, what's it called? I'm blanking, sorry. Grad student advisors, to see if they might, have that on their list of projects that they can start, seeing if there's ever a student that's interested in those things. The last thing that I want to suggest is that when you're approached, whether it's somebody you solicited or somebody who comes out of the blue, ask them some questions. Consider creating an RFP, or a research proposal document. Essentially, tell them what you need to know, ask them to propose a project to you and to fill in the blanks. One of the things that I run into a lot is researchers who say, I want you to do this. And I say, what resources do you have for me to do this? And they say, oh, I thought you would just do it. I'm like, no, like you have to think through the details. The challenge is I don't have freezer space to save samples for you. I don't have vets who can harvest the organs of every squirrel that comes in for you. So we need either funding, because I'm happy to buy more freezers. If I get funding for that, I am happy to hire more staff time or put more staff time into that if I had money, but I don't. So we have to work with what we have. And I think if we ask to be considered when they go off for grant funds and things, if they're trying to get funded, we should be part of the equation. The only way that's going to happen is if we at least have the conversation. Because maybe what you say is, what sort of funding do you have? They say none. And you say, okay, well, let's talk. Maybe you really want to do the project. You're willing to dedicate your staff time or your electricity or your freezer space or whatever. But if you start with the conversation about funding, more likely in the future, someone will come back and say, what would it take if we wanted to do this project? What sort of funding would you need? So start asking the question. The very last thing I want to just bring up with you all is to know your limits, because the last thing that we need as an not organization, as a field, is for researchers to try to work with us, for them to put a lot of money and effort into it, for projects and programs to fall through, students not to finish their projects, or staff, researchers not to be able to meet their own deadlines, and them determine us too much of a risk and too flaky as a field for them to continue working with. So it's better to under promise and make sure that you're reliable and that you get back to them and you're communicative and you actually give them what they need, than it is for you to overpromise and to work with and collaborate with too many people. We don't want someone to say, oh, it was really bad when I tried to collaborate with rehabbers. I don't want to do that anymore, and to tell their colleagues. We want their colleagues to be excited to work with us, and we want to get something out of it, because it's your time is valuable. We should get something out of it. So with that, we're too busy. We have too much going on. The reality is, we can only get things done if we prioritize them. And I think that sharing data, collecting data, publishing it sometimes falls into that nice to have category alongside other really important things that really aren't nice to have, but really are critical to our mission. And I think it's just important to recalibrate that in our head and understand that this is something we need to find a way to make space for. We're all taking care of more animals than we possibly can. All of our programs, you have a cup, and it will always be overflowing no matter how big you make the cup. So plan for data and sharing and publishing to be part of that cup so that it's included in your planning. I think that's critical for the future of our field as well as our own personal growth. And obviously, the most important being the improvement of our patients' lives. So, with that, that's my talk. I'd love it if there are questions. But also, do you have any tips for making the most of the data that you already collect?